So let's go ahead and begin. Thank you to Howard Bloom for being our guest tonight. Sarah, Lynn, Dawson, and I, we get together every Thursday and we talk about the future, sci-fi, film, books, new ideas, and we're really excited to have Howard Bloom here join us tonight. And Howard, tell us a little bit about how you got into writing.
Well, it's not so much, okay, so I was 12 years old. I was reading 2 books a day. My mother really wanted me to become acquainted with Albert Einstein. She was hoping that Albert Einstein would lead me back to God. I was an atheist. So I picked up Sarah's here.
Hi. Sorry.
So the deal is I was 12 years old. I was an atheist. My mom was trying to get me back to God, an impossible task. And at one point it occurred to her that since she felt Albert Einstein believed in God, I should get to know Albert Einstein. So I went to the local library where the librarians knew me better than my mother did. And I got a book, an autobiography by Albert Einstein. And it wasn't the book that grabbed me, it was the introduction. Sometimes you feel an author has reached out through the pages and grabbed you by the shirt front and pulled his nose up to yours. Well, that's what Albert did with this introduction. And he said this: schmuck, you want to be a genius? Then you have to be able not only to come up with a theory that only 7 people in the world can understand, but you have to be able to explain that theory so clearly that anyone with a high school degree and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. And at the same point, I was reading George Gamov's 1, 2, 3 Infinity. George Gamov is the guy who put Big Bang Theory on the map. And his book was written deliciously, story after story after story after story. And he managed to explain the most complex concepts you can think of, set theory and things like that, through stories. And it was brilliant. It was amazing. So I put it was Albert Einstein who told me, schmuck, you want to be an original scientific thinker, you're going to have to learn to write. And it was George Gamov who told me, schmuck, you want to be a delicious scientific thinker, and you're going to have to learn to write deliciously. So that was it, the Einstein imperative. That's what got me into writing.
Sorry, I'm just having issues.
What age was that at, Howard?
I believe it was 12. When I was 10 years old, I was a lost child. The other kids wanted to have nothing to do with me unless it was to humiliate me, grab your hat and throw it back and forth over your head, things like that. And my parents, for some reason, didn't have the slightest bit of interest in me. So one day I was sitting in my parents' great big bedroom with a Frank Lloyd Wright house behind us and a Frederick Olmsted Park across the street. And a book appeared in my lap. And you know how when you were a kid, you know every book your parents own, because all the books have been on the same bookshelves in exactly the same place ever since you swam into consciousness. And this book did not come from my bookshelves. I have no idea where it came from. And there it was in my lap, and it said, the first 2 rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it gave the example of Galileo. And look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look for things that are invisible to everybody else because you take them for granted, and then proceed from there. And it gave the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek, the guy who invented the microscope. And I suddenly felt I had a home, even though these scientists that I could pal around with, the way I couldn't pal around with anybody else, couldn't say no to me for a very simple reason. They were dead. So that's how I got into science. And from that point on, I started reading 2 books a day.
Wow. So avid reader, realized really soon you really had to get into writing.
To be a scientist, but to be not just a normal scientist, to be a scientific thinker who could go way outside the box.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've gone way outside the box with Sex in the Cosmos.
Right.
I mean, just the title itself is alluring. And I mean, for someone who doesn't know about Sex in the Cosmos, tell us a little bit about it. What are we missing out there?
The book is The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. Everything you know about nature is wrong. And there are two scientific principles that underlie the career of every scientist on the planet today. One is the second law of thermodynamics, and the other is the law of least effort. And the law of least effort says that nature always takes the shortest path between 2 points. And that law is not true. If that law were true, in fact, neither is the second law of thermodynamics, but that's another big question for another time. So if nature always took the shortest path between 2 points, it would never have invented sex. Just the molecular process of sex is so confounding that very few people with very high IQs can remember it. The cellular process of sex is so complex that it boggles your mind. The process of going out and finding a mate, if you are a sexual creature, is torture. It is definitely the longest line between 2 points. So sex disproves the law of least effort. And since that is a foundational rule in science, it challenges everything we know as conventional science. So that's how we get a sexual cosmos. Sex has been part of this cosmos for between 1 and 2 billion years. And that is a 12th to a 6th of the cosmos' entire life.
So sex is kind of new on the block in a way.
Well, it's new but old. It is old in terms of the timeline of the cosmos.
So sex is new but not new.
Yeah, sex is new but not new, but it is the most convoluted thing. I mean, people with Mensa credentials, people with IQs of 175 cannot recite to you the whole sexual process because they can't remember all the bits and pieces because it is so amazingly, astonishingly complicated. So there goes the law of least effort out the window.
I could tell you that from firsthand experience trying to get pregnant. My fertility experts, they're like, we don't know. And I'm like, what do you mean we don't know?
Right.
I'm paying you all this money to get me pregnant and you don't know?
Right. And just think how hard it was to go through, to find the right person, to go through the emotions of establishing a relationship, to go through the emotions that come after you establish a relationship. It is hell. I mean, there's glory and there's delight in the hell, but it's glory and delight surrounded by vast rivers of hell.
We're just talking about finding the right mate. My husband walked in, so that's interesting timing.
I'm Howard.
Hi.
This is Howard. We're on a podcast, honey. I'll see you.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, he's gorgeous. So
interesting timing, though, talking about finding the mate.
Yes.
Emotional process,
and keeping the mate from interrupting you on important calls.
That too.
Right.
Well, tell me a little bit, Howard. I can hear, how long you've been thinking about big concepts. I mean, studying Einstein and Galileo and all of these scientists. What brought you to these conclusions, and what brought you to write this book?
Well, first I need to tell you a story. When I was 12 years old, I became fascinated with the ecstatic experience. And because I knew I'd never had it, and I knew it was never going to happen in the temple, where my parents dragged me unwillingly from time to time, and where I sat there so bored that I read a book that was in front of me on, those sort of railings to hold books in, on the backs of the benches in front of you. And that book happened to be the Bible. So I read that over and over and over and over again. But the ecstatic experience, the transcendent experience, seemed to be something that Black culture had, and my culture didn't. And I wanted to find out about it from the view of what my friend Robin Fox, the founder of the anthropology department at Rutgers University, and the author of a bunch of very important books in anthropology. He called it participant observer science. In other words, you throw yourself totally into something, you become it, you eat it, you breathe it, and you sleep it. But when Margaret Mead went off to Samoa, she did this so effectively that the Samoans voted her a chief, even though foreigners as chiefs, no, sorry, wasn't possible. And women as chiefs, no, sorry, impossible. And yet they voted her chief because she became so successful at ingesting every bit of what it meant to be Samoan. And I wanted to do that someday with the ecstatic experience, the transcendent experience, which, according to a book I was reading at the age of 12 by the Lomax brothers, who used to go out with a giant tape recorder, which was the bleeding edge in technology of its time, stick it in the trunk of their car and go down south and record every bit of folk music that they could find, including the folk music of the Black community. And they brought me a word, soul. And that word became incredibly important to me. So when I graduated from NYU after having accidentally helped found the hippie movement and hitchhiked and ridden freight trains illegally and all kinds of adventures, which are in my book, How I Accidentally Started in the 60s, I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, and I had fellowships, graduate fellowships in something that didn't have a name yet. Today we call it neuroscience, and I was going to have to paste the whole program together by myself from the courses that they were giving. Well, I suddenly realized this was Auschwitz for my mind. I'd be working under the whip of a grad school, whatever you call it, mentor, the person who trains you. I don't want to be trained. I'm sorry, I have my own ways of doing things. I don't want to become a robot in somebody else's process. And I do not want to be limited to the experiences I can have giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit. Where in the world, in that room with 22 students, are you going to find the ecstatic experience? Nowhere, absolutely nowhere. So with nudging from my wife, who was tired of having student husbands, I was student husband number 2, I jumped ship. And I went into a field I knew absolutely nothing about, popular culture. Because popular culture was the culture of the kids who used to beat me up. My culture was Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky, Rachmaninoff, people like that. I dove in, and after a few years, and I studied insanely, absolutely insanely, to understand this field I knew nothing about. And after a few years, I started a public relations firm in the music industry. And the music industry was where I found the gods inside of us. I walked into my first, I became before I started the PR firm, I became an editor of a magazine. And because writing was so important to me, and I was doing it I was a contributing editor to 2 magazines. I had founded a commercial art studio, which became one of the leading avant-garde commercial art studios on the East Coast. And I knew I had to write for magazines because I had to contact that audience that Albert Einstein and George Gamow implicitly told me was the audience I had to reach with my science. And I used to co-design some of my own clothes and buy clothes from the clothing designer I was collaborating with. So one day I was going to take my art portfolio up to a new magazine, an underground fashion magazine, founded with money from the guy who bankrolled Rolling Stone. And it had an office in an extremely unusual place. Nobody else had offices in this neighborhood, the Garment District. Logical for a magazine called Rags, right? So I went up the freight elevator, which is the only elevator there was, to the 3rd floor. And I stepped out of these big, cumbersome doors. And I expected to go to a table and lay down my portfolio and open it up and have the three women in the room ooh and ah over the pictures. That's not what happened. Instead, they all stood there with their mouths agape, their jaws hanging, looking at my clothes. And the editor over the other two editors pointed at me and she said, "Do you have more of these?" And I said, "Yes, I have a whole closet full of them. Why?" And she said, "Do you think you could write an article about these?" And of course I could. So I turned in an article the next day and I became a contributing editor and wrote 175 pieces for that magazine. And then another contributing editor said, "I'm starting a magazine called Natural Lifestyles. Would you agree to be a contributing editor to Natural Lifestyles?" So I wrote tons of articles for them too. And one day I was, I brought in a magazine that was incredibly successful, that only came out twice a year from Boston, and then sold on newsstands all across North America within hours. And a wannabe publisher who had invented the American Express card and made a fortune took me in as if I were his son. And he flew up to Boston and said to the kids who put out this dynamite magazine, "Why don't you do this on a monthly basis? If you do, I'll move you to New York. I'll give you gorgeous apartments. You'll have girls crawling all over you."
Good incentive for a 20 or something year old, right?
Right. And so they agreed to come to New York and do the magazine monthly, and it was called the National Lampoon.
Hmm.
So I got my art studio the account of art directing the National Lampoon. And as soon as I did, there was one member of the studio whose work I loathed, but he came in because a genius artist had said, I'll only work with you if you take in my friend, the awful artist, the vomititious artist." And the vomititious artist organized everybody and told them, "Look, if we throw Howard out, we can divide his money between us." And he took over the art direction of the magazine, and you're not allowed to say this word these days, he queered it. He destroyed it for all of the guys who had voted to vote me out. They lost the account after 7 issues. They did a terrible job. And I, meanwhile, one day was covering a parapsychology conference for Natural Lifestyles magazine. And a kid walked up to me, seeing a pad in my left hand and a pen, constantly taking notes in my right, and said, "Would you like to edit a magazine?" Well, I was getting up at 6 a.m, going naked to an old Remington typewriter whose keys you had to hit with a sledgehammer, and writing for an hour, and then coming home at night from the art studio and writing until 11 o'clock at night when it was time to go to bed. And I was getting tired. And I thought, wow, if I edit a magazine, then I can write during normal hours. So when he said, "Would
And
you
get
like
paid
to
for it.
Yeah. And so when he said, "Would you like to edit a magazine?" I said, yes. So a few days later, he gave me a name and an address of a place to go and a person to set up a meeting with. So I set up the meeting, and I had no idea of what this magazine was about. But between my freshman and sophomore year of college, I had wanted a job in editorial, since writing was an obsession for me, along with my science. And I listed the 98 employment bureaus that had jobs in editorial that it listed in the New York Times want ads. And I called 97 of them. And every single one of them said, "No, I'm sorry, we don't have anything for you." I had one left. I called it and they said, "Oh, we think we have something for you." And it turned out to be a job, originally proofreading for the Boy Scouts of America, and then became editing and writing. They moved me up very fast for the Boy Scouts of America. Now, here is the irony. I had been thrown out of the Boy Scouts at age 11 for incompetence at Morse code. And if they hadn't thrown me out for that, they could have thrown me out for incompetence at not time. I couldn't find my way into a forest, much less out of a forest. But I learned that if you have a sufficient library and you really love your audience and want them to succeed in the information you're giving them, then you can write for anybody. So I didn't ask what the magazine was about. So I went to a meeting in this gorgeous office with 7 windows overlooking the East River, right above the United Nations, one UN plaza. Johnny Carson lived there. And the man I was meeting with was the publisher. And I asked him what his magazine was. And he said circus. And I thought, well, I really don't like elephants and clowns, but I can write about anything. Look what you did for the Boy Scouts. I mean, I wrote a book for the Boy Scouts called 10 Steps to Organize a Boy Scout Troop. That's the handbook that's used to organize every single new Boy Scout troop. So, and he said, no, it's about rock and roll. Well, I knew nothing about rock and roll. So for the next 2 years, first of all, I studied. He gave me 2 magazines to study in Europe that had circulations of over 1 million. And here in the United States, in a market 5 times as big, Rolling Stone only sold 250,000 copies a month. So I studied those magazines for a year, as he had asked me to. And then I came to him and said, look, I know your formula. You don't like repeating people, but I'm going to give you a formula that I've derived from these 2 magazines you threw at me. And I guarantee you it's going to work. And one thing, remember, the truth and any price, including the price of your life, I only say something like that when I know I can do it. And I said, you're going to have to give me access to your sales figures so I could do a few simple correlational studies. And then we instituted the new formula. And over the course of the next 12 months, we increased the circulation of the magazine 211%, which shows you what growing up on reading the Scientific American, and especially Martin Gardner's mathematical game section, can do for your ways of thinking that you can take into all kinds of different territories.
Yeah.
So when he came to me and after a year, and he said, don't you think it's about time for you to ask for a raise? Well, I'd never worked for anybody before. And so I didn't know about rituals like raises. So I called my friends from Rags Magazine, who when Rags closed, had one of them helped co-found Ms. with Gloria Steinem. Another was working at Vogue. And I said, how much should I ask for in a raise? And they said, tell me what you do. And I told them. Now, one thing you have to know, the day I walked into my meeting with the publisher, not knowing anything about his magazine, there was a room on the opposite side of the hallway from his magnificent 7-window office, and it had 2 guys in it. It was a converted broom closet, and they were leaving. They were packing to leave. So he'd had 2 editors, and he replaced 2 editors with me. So I was doing the work of 2 editors, which I don't mind at all, or didn't in those days. When I left, they had to replace me with 5 editors. So at any rate, so I described what I did, and they said, you should be getting a 50% raise. So I came to my publisher with a 50% raise, and he said, no, that's more than I can afford. And so I gave him 6 months notice just to retain my dignity. And then I had no place to go. So the person I hired to edit the magazine after me, who was really a terrific, wonderful writer, said, I want you to meet somebody. And he introduced me to a guy named Seymour Stein. And Seymour Stein had founded a record company called Sire Records. And eventually he would go on to find Madonna. Big difference. At any rate, so Seymour got me a job creating a public and artist relations department from scratch for Gulf and Western's 14 different record companies. So I ended up, I'm doing a Margaret Mead Samoa here. And
You're diving in.
Right.
You're diving in with no no plan, just fully immersing yourself.
Right. Except remember, I'd spent 2 years taking calls from publicists. I'd spent 2 years getting mailers from publicists. I knew what mailers worked and what mailers didn't. I knew what phone calls worked and what phone calls didn't. It was 2 years of schooling. And so at any rate, I worked very, very hard, and and every time I needed a new staff member, they gave it to me. And I ended up with a staff of 5, while everybody else was being told to save on yellow pads and save on pencils, and was losing staff members. And I had no idea of why they were doing this. And then they sold the company to ABC Records. And I got a call from the negotiator who did the Gulf and Western part of the deal. And he said, you know why we were able to sell that little pissant record company for so much money to ABC Records? Well, I had no clue. Business is not, money's not my thing. I'm in it for the knowledge. That is the payoff for me. He said, well, it was because of you. And I said, that's impossible. And he said, no, you don't realize it, but you've doubled the value of that company. So at any rate, eventually, I was doing very well at ABC Records, and eventually there was an executive on the 33rd floor. That's a top executive where they have the executive dining room and the Picassos. And he used to call me up periodically to come up and meet with him. And I would give him the results of my correlational studies that demonstrated that artists that tour, in other words, artists that form an in-person bond with their audience, sell more records, far more records, than artists who don't. The artists who don't, if they're lucky, have a hit. And if they're even luckier, they have another hit. And that's the end of them. That's the last you ever hear of them. But artists who've been touring and building that bond with kids all over the world, those are the artists who punch through, especially if they have an ecstatic experience on stage. Because I discovered I was in the land of the gods. I was in the land of soul. I was in the land of exhilarated spirits, of ecstatic experiences. And so I gave him all this information. He wanted me to find out why Columbia Records did so well. Every year, CBS and Warner Brothers, basically each one owned 33% of the record market. That's astonishing. And even when Columbia changed presidents, they kept that 33% of the record industry. So I studied that and came back to him with reports on how it worked and why it worked. And he did something astonishingly stupid. He fired everybody at ABC Records, with the exception of me. The new head, he figured that Clive Davis had succeeded at CBS because Clive Davis was a lawyer. That's ridiculous. Clive Davis succeeded because he had a golden ear. He could hear really good music. And so he hired a lawyer to take over ABC. And they fired everybody. And that included me. So I was out. I immediately got another job. But I was basically felt a bit lost. And Seymour Stein, the guy who founded Sire Records and would eventually discover Madonna, said, Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company? So I started a PR firm in the music industry as a person who'd only been studying music intently now for 4 years. And because we took a whole radically different approach from anybody else, an approach that came from being a scientist plonked down on a foreign planet for all practical purposes in my own Samoa, my approach was nothing like the approach anybody else used. I was credited with reinventing publicity in the music industry. And if you were a manager and you came to me and you managed Sarah and you said, we're interested in hiring you for Sarah Lynn Dawson, I would give you a speech, and the speech would go like this. If you expect me to fashion an artificial mask for Sarah and then sit back in my seat like a guy with a plaid suit with a cigar in his hand, flicking the cigar and saying, with this with this image, I'm going to make you a star. Then I'll send you my closest competitor. If you're going to work with me, you have to understand that music is not an exchange of pieces of plastic. It is not an exchange of money or downloads. It is an exchange of human soul. And if you're going to work with me, I'm going to study you. I'm going to study Sarah for 6 weeks. I'm going to look at everything she's ever written, every record she's ever put out, every album cover. And I will compile a preliminary sketch of who Sarah is. Then I will require that you allow me to go to wherever Sarah, whatever environment reflects Sarah the most, and spend anywhere from 1 to 3 days with her without managers, without assistants, without wives, just Sarah and me alone in the room, because I want to find the gods inside of her that write her lyrics or that dance her on stage when she is doing one of those ecstatic performances that gets the audience ecstatic. If you're willing to do that, I will work with you. And so I ended up working with Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, Run DMC, ZZ Top. I mean, the list goes on and on. And for the time that I was in the industry, I would not allow the word marketing anywhere near my clients. I would not allow the word branding anywhere near my clients. I would not allow the word product anywhere near my clients, because those hid the essence of a profoundly human process. Those demystified or dehumanized the process we were going through. And after 17 years of doing that, or 12 years of doing that, I got very sick. And now I'd gone into this out of the scientific curiosity that I'd had when I was 12. That if science as I interpreted it when I was 12, was an aspiration to omniscience. And that meant see everything you can. See the things that no one around you is seeing, and experience them and bring them into the realm of science. And that's what I was doing with my time in popular culture and my time in rock and roll. And so I got very sick. I spent 15 years in bed. For 5 of those years, I was too weak to talk and too weak to have another person in the room with me. And it took me 3 years to reorient myself, but it allowed me to go back to my science. I already had the first half of my first book, The Lucifer Principle, a scientific expedition into the forces of history, written when I got sick. And so I finished I finished that book. I wrote a total of 3 books while I was sick in bed. I founded 2 international scientific groups while I was sick in bed, because even if I couldn't talk, I could type. So I was talking to science colleagues all over the world. But since I was founding the groups, I wouldn't say dictate their focus, but I could create their focus and bring other people into the framework of that focus. And it was a remarkable experience. And then
sorry, first of all, I'm so sorry you were sick. That sounds terrible. But I just wanted to mention, I was just reading that George Orwell, he wrote 1984, I believe,
right.
He was so sick.
He wrote because he went off to the Spanish Civil War, which was the big thing for Western idealists to do at the time. And he made some very interesting discoveries about human political nature. And so I didn't know he wrote up his results, because he threw himself into that the way I and Margaret Mead threw ourselves into our subject. So, but I didn't know he was sick. That's amazing.
Yes.
Well, there 2 other people who were sick like this. One was Charles Darwin. Because he was sick, there was no way he could go to the Royal Society 40 or 50 miles away from his cottage and make presentations on his new theory himself. So that's why he had to rely on, what was his name? Darwin's bulldog. but he had to rely on somebody else to go to bat for him. And he picked somebody truly remarkable to go to bat for him. And the founder of the Red Cross and modern nursing, Florence Nightingale, also became so sick that she couldn't have another person in the room with her, and that she had to have drapes over the windows. And another person who got that sick was the author of En recherche de temps perdu, in search of lost times. Proust, Marcel Proust. He had his walls lined with cork because he couldn't take any stimulus from outside at all. So,
Gosh.
Do you feel like that time, it sounds like it was like a hyper focus or some sort of echo chamber for you to create, to write, to study?
It was extremely valuable for me. It was, I mean, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of isolation when you're in a room, and my wife eventually left me. So that meant real isolation. That isolation kills. Solitary confinement is a greater punishment than you can imagine, because your mind comes alive with tortures that you don't have words for. It's hideous. It's a monstrous experience. But yes, it gave me the opportunity to dive back into my science. You know, when you're successful at something and you're literally a legend in your field, your wife is not going to let you out of that field. When I was writing the Lucifer Principle, I felt it was time. When I got a call from Mick Jagger's assistant saying Mick is interested in working with you, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be pushed around and humiliated by a spoiled rock star. And when I got a call from U2, well, I never liked their music. I'd already done this and made several acts that were huge, and I didn't want to do it again. All of my intellectual questions have been answered. I wanted out. But there's no way your wife will let you out, because you're earning a good income, and what you're doing, well, my wife didn't care about prestige, but it was prestigious. So the illness came along at just the right time. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, it was a hyper focus and a way out of that. It's interesting. You said your first book was called the Lucifer Principle, and you were sort of almost being attacked, by your thoughts, maybe at this dark time or rebirth time.
That's true, but the name really the title came from the day that Peter, oh God, what is his name? The former lead singer for Genesis.
Peter Gabriel?
Yes, Peter Gabriel, thank you. So Peter Gabriel walked into my office, and he knew my interests. And Peter said, I think there's something you should read. It's called the Gaia Effect. So I hunted down, in those days we didn't have Google. It was much harder hunting things down. But I did manage to find an article that Lynn Margulis, the co-founder of the Gaia Effect, and her son Dorian Sagan, Carl Sagan's oldest son, Lynn's first husband was Carl Sagan, that they had written about the Gaia Effect. And the article got wildly celebratory about a period of time in which just about every form of creature on Earth died off. Well, all the creatures on Earth were microbes at the time, but they were dying off in mass quantities. And I grew up believing that if you see a mass murder taking place and you don't try to stop it, you're a participant and an accomplice. So I just rebelled against this idea that this huge die-off was a glorious thing, even though it had glorious consequences. It gave birth to the kind of cells that live in the three of us. And so I immediately thought, I got to write the flip side of this. I got to write, if they did the Gaia Effect, I'm going to do the Lucifer Principle. So that's how that book title in that book came about. But I really realized, I mean, look, I was raised by books. Those 2 books that I read a day, those raised me. So I was raised by books the way Mowgli, in the Jungle Tales, whatever it's called, Rudyard Kipling, was raised by wolves. And so I knew that in my 40s, I was going to have to write my first book, even though that was very late to start on your first book. First, I had to do these Jungle Book, yes. So,
Yes.
so first I was going to have to do my Margaret Meading, which turned out to be, like as Margaret Mead had been named a tribal chief, I became a tribal chief in the world of rock and roll. Now I had a chance to actually concentrate on writing my first book, to finish it, and selling it was extremely hard. It took 4 years to sell it. And then once it was sold, it sold about 140,000 copies around the world. It's still selling today. A long time. I mean, it came out in 1995. So that's 30 years ago. And it's still selling. So, and some people call it their Bible. So that's what gave me permission to go back and to my science. The impetus for the case of the sexual cosmos was that I had been sensing, first of all, that the second law of thermodynamics is wrong, 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 wrong. It doesn't apply in this universe. And a theory that doesn't apply in this universe is a nice piece of speculation for another universe, but this isn't it. Plus, another universe would not be able to tolerate the second law of thermodynamics either, because it means that everything that you've built is falling apart constantly. And if it's falling apart constantly, how do you rebuild? How do you build more than you're destroying? This universe does that by a long shot, but the second law of thermodynamics is fundamentally wrong. And realizing I was asked to do a talk in New Paltz at the college up there, and the first thing that occurred to me was, if that sex is the disproof of the law of least effort and a disproof of the second law of thermodynamics. So that's when I started gestating this idea, but it took 14 years to write this book.
Wow, that is a long, long time.
Yep. So, but it's paid off. I mean, the things that people are saying about the book are utterly astonishing. Some people are using this book, not just, I mean, I learned from George Gamow, if I want to get a complex concept across to you, I have to tell you a story. And if I tell you a story that gets that concept across, you will never forget it. And the complexities of the concept, hell, who cares? You'll understand it anyway. So people have been saying, and this book is a counter to the books that say we're about to destroy the earth. It proves that we are not about to destroy the earth, that in fact we've been fructifying the earth. The amount of, I mean, one of nature's most precious creations is awareness, is sentience. And we have been increasing the amount of sentience on this planet by leaps and bounds, not to mention by leaps and frogs. But so the arguments of the doomists, the people like Greta Thunberg, are wrong. Yes, it's possible we are, and very likely, that we're increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and thus increasing the heating of the earth. But this planet has been the planet of climate catastrophe since it first formed 4.5 billion years ago. It swiveled around its axis at that point every 6 hours, which means that for 3 hours, if you were on the surface of this thing, the earth, you would have been drenched in something totally poisonous, radiation. And then you would have gone into something equally poisonous, darkness. And when you did, there would be a massive climate shift. The temperature would go down 88 degrees. And then 3 hours later, the temperature would go whomping up again, 88 degrees, and you'd be in the poison of ultraviolet light. And yet life dared to say, fuck you, to these problems and impossibilities. Life is a doom writer and a catastrophe tamer. Life takes catastrophe and turns it into opportunity. And that's why life is still here after almost 4 billion years. And that's why life keeps getting a better handle on things and making more life. And now, not just making life, making awareness, making cognition, making things like words, and symbols, painting, cave paintings, and cities, and these astonishing things. I don't know how the person who came up with this idea ever sold it to his tribe, taking mud, which is poisonous in the rainy season, because you're stuck walking across it and it comes up to your knees, and you're very lucky to make it across to your destination, because some people don't, and those are the bog people that we keep finding around the world. And this nutcase came up with this idea of taking this poisonous stuff, mud, and patting it into a form no human had ever seen before, a rectangular form which had never existed before, except in crystals too small for humans to see. And then, not just making one or two of them, he had to get his whole tribe moving, because he had to create 3 million of them in order to make the world's first city of garden apartments, Katal Hayuk, in what is today Turkey. Imagine the astonishment of pulling all of that off. Well, that's the kind of thing that this earth is nurturing and increasing fertility, fecundity. We used to have a giant technological revolution every 2,000 years. Then came 1800, and we started having giant technological revolutions every 15 years. Then came 2007. Well, actually, 1983. Peter Gabriel and I did a project where we were predicting what home technology would be like in a year that seemed incredibly far away, 1990. And I came up with all of these elaborate ideas, like your coffee table would have the ability to create holograms, and you'd be able to see Mick Jagger performing on your coffee table. And if you applauded him, he would come over to the edge and throw rose petals at you. And if you booed, he would stick his ass out at you. My ideas never came to pass. Peter's idea was simple: the democratization of the computer. And at that point, most computers were owned by giant corporations or the government because they were hideously expensive. And he was right. We came up with that project in 1979. By 1983, I was able to buy 17 computers to computerize my office. And then later came the laptop. And things have never been the same. And then there was another technological revolution when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. And in 1995, when the World Wide Web was created, in 2005, when Google was invented. All these things added to our powers as humans, which means that if it's true that we are the only life forms in the cosmos, because despite the spotty rocks from Mars, we have never found life anywhere else, and we've been looking vigorously since roughly 1975. If we're the only life forms, these new empowerments that we create for ourselves are the first time those empowerments ever existed in the cosmos. That means we are adding to the toolkit of the universe herself. So we are doing important work down here. We have a long way to go in that work, because the cosmos is a search engine, searching out her next possibilities and turning the impossible into the ordinary, time after time after time after time. And we are her instruments for speeding up that process dramatically. So let us not get into Greta Thunberg's mood and start destroying what we have built. Let us build our way out of this. And the book, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos, Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, talks about climate stabilization technologies and how, if taking carbon out of the atmosphere we regard as a climate stabilization technology, that's great, because we are overdue for the next great ice age. And we have had many, many great global warmings that have been so much more severe than the one we are going through right now, that there have been dinosaurs eating tropical plants at the South Pole. So
that's quite warm.
Yeah, in scientific terms, this universe goes from greenhouse to ice house and greenhouse to ice house again. And the next ice house or the next greenhouse, one so that makes our contribution to global warming look puny, is right around the corner. We're overdue for a massive climate change. Normally, the kind of lapse that we've had of stability in the climate lasts about 10,000 years. Ours has lasted 12,000 years. We are overdue
Yeah, well,
for,
we're kind of in borrowed time, it sounds like.
yeah, right. So we have to develop these climate stabilization technologies. And the one I've proposed is space solar power, harvesting solar power in space, beaming it down to Earth using the kind of harmless waves that your cell phone uses, and thus eliminating the need to use fossil fuels for transportation and power generation. And that would bring us to net zero. But then we have to realize the next big smack up the side of the head from an ice age or a global warming is right around the corner. And we have to stop blaming everything on ourselves. This is a religious pattern. You blame everything on yourself, and then you give sacrifices to the powers above you. We call those powers nature. And nature will return you to a Garden of Eden. It doesn't work like that. There's never been a Garden of Eden on this planet. Nature, for some reason, loves death and pain. Nature loves death and pain. It's not us who have invented death and pain. It's nature. And our job is to undo what we see as the inequities, the injustices that nature herself metes out, like death and pain. That's our job. And to do that, we have to keep being the tendrils of nature, being the antennae, the fingertips of nature, searching for the next possibility, yanking it into the realm of the real and the ordinary, and using it as the stair step from which to reach the impossibility beyond it. So that's what this book says, in essence. But there's a lot more.
That's fantastic. I'm curious, Howard, if instead of the first and second rule of thermodynamics that they teach in physics now, if your book was adopted on mass scale, what do you think the world would look like?
Well, first, in terms of the first law of second law of thermodynamics, this book proposes the first law of flamboyance, that the universe is always reaching out to the next level of astonishment, the next level of flamboyance. We call that the level of complexity that underrates it dramatically. So if people adopted this book, those two laws would go out the window, and the question would become, how does nature pull off what it does? And how can we pull off even more of it? And that's a big turnaround, because right now, I belong to several scientific groups, and those groups are constantly arguing about thermodynamics. They're constantly agreeing that thermodynamics is the most important thing you can address in science. And then they're doing what the 12 angels dancing on the head of a pin theorists did in 1200. They are just going up their own anuses. And it's getting, so I'm watching them waste 95% of their energy on this futile quest to solve everything that's going on in the universe through the laws of thermodynamics. And it can't be done. So it's as if you had a Porsche, and you had a bunch of scientists that concluded that, yes, the Porsche does miraculous things. I mean, it goes from 0 to 80 in 2.5 minutes or something like that. But how does it do it? Well, let's study the exhaust. We'll learn everything we need to know about how the Porsche does its magic by studying the exhaust. That is literally what we've been doing ever since 1850, because in 1850, a college professor named William Thomson said that 80% of the energy of a steam engine is lost in friction. And then his collaborator in Berlin, his long distance collaborator, I forget his name, but at any rate, he came up with a word for this. He called it entropy. And 10 years later, he managed to boil the field they both called thermodynamics, the field they were founding. down to two, he called them theorems. And they were renamed as two laws. And the second one was entropy in the universe is constantly on an increase. It's not true. And we can go into how I disprove it some other time, because I think I have to go do my Thursday night homework.
Yeah, I know we want to honor your time, but I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe shine a light on what it could look like if we adopted this en masse. And I think
we would be freed to look at the Porsche instead of the exhaust. We would be free to look at the steam engine instead of the 80% of energy that's lost to friction. We would be free to see that every form of friction produces something somebody else eats. Every form of waste. I tackle 4 sins in this book, in the case of the sexual cosmos. They are materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display. And I show you that these are not human frailties. These are nature's tricks. Nature has been using these 4 things for a very long time. And if we understand that, and understand that nature uses the male-female relationship and the courtship that males have to go through. I mean, you know, some euglossine bees, orchid bees, some orchid bee females are so picky that you have to mix 5 different odors from 5 radically different sources, and you have to do it in precisely the right way, or a female bee, if you're a male, will not speak to you. It's as simple as that. So females in nature require males to do impossible things. Now, what's the value of doing impossible things? You add to the toolkit of nature, especially if you've got a species like ours that doesn't take notes on new inventions just in genes, but takes notes in text and pictures. And those notes become part of a permanent heritage that we call culture. You know, right now we are using words that were invented probably 200,000 years ago. We are using sentence forms that were invented probably 200,000 years ago. And we use them every day because the culture within which we live and which we perpetuate has thousands of generations, the knowledge, the insights, the inventions of thousands of generations of our ancestors. It's called time binding. And we have it, and other creatures, for the most part, do not. So, and that's what makes us nature's most successful probe into the realm of the impossible.
can you see some of the questions that have been posted?
Wait, let me go down and see. Let me go down and see. Hang on. So, Jungle Book, yes. Would you say the arguments are bound to anthropocentrism? I use a lot of anthropocentrism. And in one of my books, The God Problem, I show you why anthropocentrism is not what it seems. For example, I say that in the Big Bang, this cosmos showed an incredible audacity, will, and ambition. Those are all anthropomorphisms, right? But if you go back to the beginning of the cosmos, there is an impulsive force that spreads out a universe from nothing. That's a primitive form of will. There are patterns. There are patterns that show up on level after level after level of emergence. And they show up on our level, but that doesn't mean they don't show up in a more primitive form on other levels. And that impulsive drive to spread out at astonishing speeds is the pattern of will incarnate. It's the pattern of ambition incarnate. Why do I say that? Because in the first 10 to the minus 32nd, that is the tiniest sliver of a sliver of a sliver of a second of the universe's existence, that astonishing spreading sheet of space and time precipitated the way that raindrops precipitate from a cloud. And it precipitated into the very first things, quarks and leptons. That is ambition. That is a universe that's that starts climbing the staircase of audacity, the staircase of flamboyance, in its first tiniest fraction of a second of its existence. So even though these things don't manifest themselves precisely the way they manifest in humans, in ambition and will, they are the primitive precursors. So in a certain way, anthropomorphism in science can pay off big time. So that was that question. Did that make any sense? Okay, leads to renewal. Yeah, the universe constantly creates degradation in order to create renewal. For example, once upon a time, there were these incredibly materialistic plants. And they were so materialistic that they were able to take a recently invented substance, lignin and cellulose, and they were able to pack it into these giant towers. And each one of these towers put out 200,000 leaves. That is materialism to the nth degree. And then what did it do at the end of the summer? Another massive climate change, summer, winter, fall, and spring, that we ignore. It's just one of the fruits of living on planet Earth, on the planet of climate catastrophe. So what did they do at the end of the summer? They discarded their leaves. This is waste. This is materialism, consumerism, and waste right in front of your nose. And what happened with all those discarded leaves? Microbes ate them. Bacteria ate them, and it enriched the quality of the soil and produced a different kind of soil than this earth had ever seen before. And those giant materialistic things that dared to break nature's most basic rule, the law of gravity, and rise to 70 feet, 90 feet, and 100 feet high, those are called trees. They were violently unnatural at the time. And they took advantage of 3 of the 4 basic sins: materialism, consumerism, and waste. They were not capable of vain. They did a certain amount of vain display once pollination was invented, but that's a whole other story how pollination was invented, because pollination is a multi-species commerce between plants and insects. And that came to be when the first flowers emerged 132 million years ago. But the really big revolution happened 15 million years into flowers' existence, when they realized that they could, they used to use the winds to disperse their pollen, their sperm. But they realized there were these insects that were trying to steal their pollen and nectar. So if they simply produced extra pollen and nectar, they could attract those insects. And because those insects got their biggest payoff on a certain kind of plant, they would go hunt for another plant of exactly that species, and you'd have federal expressing of your sperm. No more having to spread it out in the winds. This was the invention of multi-species commerce. And then the plants realized that if they advertised their nectar and their pollen, they could leap ahead of their competitors. So indeed, they put an awful lot of material, 50% roughly, of the energy that they were able to generate into making advertisements, billboards. We call them flowers. And the smells of flowers, all of that is designed to attract the insect of your dreams, who will take your pollen to the plant of your dreams, another member of your species just aching for some foreign pollen. So that was the beginning of the 4th sin, vain display. And it has paid off ever since.
Well, I'm grateful. I love flowers, and I don't think I'll look at a tree. I think I'm going to look at a tree quite differently now that you explained that. Thank you so much, Howard, for everything you shared about your life and how you got to this book. I hope that my children read this in their physics class and not the other guy's theory.
That would be wonderful. Well, Emily, Sarah, Hans,
Thank you
have a
so
wonderful
much, Howard.
Yeah,
That was
wish-
fantastic.
yeah, wish me luck in my Thursday night work, and hopefully I will see you guys again soon.
Yes,
love that.
that'd be great.